was a dark, rainy evening when Anna moved into her new apartment. It was a small, two-bedroom unit in an old building, but it was affordable, and she had been searching for a place for months. The landlord, an elderly man with graying hair and tired eyes, handed her the keys with a stern warning. "This building has a history, miss. You might feel things, see things, just don't let it get to you." Anna laughed it off. After all, she had heard stories about old buildings being haunted, but she had never put much stock into it. The apartment was cozy, the kind of place you could imagine yourself settling into for years. But from the very first night, something felt off. It started with the sounds. Strange, faint tapping noises, like someone was knocking on the walls, but when Anna checked, the source was never clear. The taps always came when the house was quiet, usually in the dead of night, and often when she was just about to fall asleep. The apartment's old wooden floors creaked underfoot, but that wasn't unusual for a place this age. It was the other noises that made Anna uneasy. The soft, dragging sounds from the hallway, the whispering voices that seemed to come from nowhere. It was on the third night that Anna noticed something more tangible. As she sat on the couch reading, she caught a glimpse of movement out of the corner of her eye. At first, she thought it was just a trick of the light, but when she turned to look, she saw a dark figure standing in the doorway to her bedroom. The figure was tall, almost unnaturally so, with long arms that seemed to stretch into the dim light of the hallway. It wasn't a person. Its shape was too fluid, like a shadow, but it was solid enough to block out the light from the hall. Her heart raced as she jumped to her feet, but the figure vanished in the blink of an eye. Her breath caught in her throat. Was she seeing things? She hadn't had anything to drink, and she was certainly not tired enough to hallucinate. The next few days were worse. The strange occurrences multiplied. Doors would open and close by themselves. The faucets in the kitchen would turn on without explanation. At night, Anna would wake up feeling like she wasn't alone, but when she turned over to look, her room was empty. Every so often, she'd wake to find her covers had been pulled down, or her pillow had shifted across the bed, though she was certain she hadn't moved. Terrified, Anna decided to visit the landlord to ask about the apartment's history, hoping to explain away the strange occurrences. "Ah, I see you're noticing it now," the landlord said, his voice unusually cold. "It's always been like this. It's the building, I'm afraid. There's something here, something we can't explain. It's not violent, but it does. Watch." Anna pressed for more details, but the landlord only muttered about past tenants who'd felt the same presence. All of them eventually leaving after a few months. No one had ever stayed long enough to understand what the entity wanted or why it was there. That night, after her visit, the atmosphere in the apartment grew heavier. The shadowy figure was back again. This time, it didn't vanish. It stood by her bedroom door for what felt like hours, watching her. Anna tried to ignore it, convincing herself it was just her imagination. But every time she closed her eyes, she felt its presence. Finally, after several sleepless nights, she made the decision to leave the apartment. But when she went to gather her things, she found something disturbing. On the wall, written in what looked like dark, smeared ink, was a single sentence: "You can't leave." Terrified, Anna packed her bags and never looked back. To this day, no one knows exactly what haunts the building at 3B. Some say it's the ghost of a former tenant who died under mysterious circumstances, while others claim it's something older, something that was never human. But one thing is certain: once you've lived in apartment 3B, you never truly leave. When a new tenant moved into a quiet, seemingly ordinary apartment complex, Little did they know that they would be tormented by something that had been hidden in the building for years. It was a cold autumn evening when Kate, a young woman in her mid-20s, moved into her new apartment in a historic building in the city. The complex, built in the early 1900s, had seen better days, but it still held a certain charm: exposed brick walls, tall ceilings, and creaky wooden floors. Kate had been looking for a place to live for a while, and this one seemed perfect. Affordable, close to work, and with a quiet, almost old-world feel to it. Her neighbors were quiet, mostly elderly people who had lived in the building for decades. Kate felt a sense of safety in that, knowing the building's history had been peaceful. But that peace was shattered on her second night. Kate had been unpacking well into the evening, trying to get everything settled before the work week began. Around midnight, she started hearing strange noises. At first, she brushed it off as the usual creaks of an old building. But then it got worse. Thump, thump, thump. There was a rhythmic banging coming from below her apartment. At first, she thought it might be her downstairs neighbor moving furniture or some kind of maintenance work. But the noise was too consistent, too unsettling. Maybe I'm just tired, she thought. But then it stopped. The silence was thick and eerie. Then the knocking began. Knock, knock, knock. Soft, deliberate knocks on the ceiling. It wasn't the usual pipes or building sounds. These were purposeful. The knocks were too human. Kate's heart began to race. She went to the door and opened it, checking the hallway. There was no one there. The air was cold and the hallway lights flickered faintly. As she turned back into her apartment, she could feel an inexplicable chill that seemed to come from nowhere. The temperature had dropped several degrees in a matter of minutes. It didn't stop there. The knocking became louder, more frantic, almost pleading. It sounded like it was coming from the apartment directly below hers. But when Kate checked with her neighbor downstairs, an elderly woman named Mrs. Shaw, she was told the same thing. "I hear nothing, dear. It's just the old house settling." But that night, the noises continued, and they grew more disturbing. It wasn't just knocks anymore, it was a scraping sound, like nails dragging on wood. Terrified, Kate decided to investigate. She snuck down to the basement to check out the maintenance room, thinking maybe the sound was coming from some kind of old pipes or equipment. But as she entered the dimly lit space, she noticed something odd. A door, tucked away in the back corner of the room. The door was small and weathered, as though it hadn't been opened in years. Kate, despite the sense of dread creeping up her spine, approached the door. It was locked, but the moment her hand brushed against the cold metal, she felt an overwhelming sense of unease. Something wasn't right. Curious, she found a maintenance key and unlocked the door. Inside, there was nothing but dust and cobwebs, but the air felt suffocating, thick with something ancient. As Kate stepped into the small, cramped room, her foot hit something hard. She bent down and found a metal grate in the floor, just slightly askew. Her breath caught in her throat. The scraping noises had come from beneath this floor. The grate led to a narrow tunnel. Her heart raced. She grabbed her phone and called a friend to come over immediately. But when she turned to leave the room, she heard it, whispering. It was faint, just on the edge of hearing, but unmistakable. "Help, help me." Terrified, Kate backed out of the room and slammed the door shut. When her friend arrived, they managed to convince the building management to inspect the strange, locked room. But when they returned, the room was gone. The door was sealed. The tunnel, as far as they could tell, never existed. Yet, Kate could never shake the feeling that the noises, the whispers, the sense of being watched followed her. And even stranger, when she later asked Mrs. Shaw about the history of the building, she was told a chilling tale. Years ago, a young woman had gone missing from the apartment complex. No one knew where she had gone, but rumors spread that she had been trapped somewhere in the building, trying to escape, trying to be heard. The whispers that Kate had heard were the last remnants of her pain, forever lingering in the walls of that apartment complex. To this day, Kate can't explain what happened that night. Was it a nightmare, or was it something far darker? I moved into my first apartment alone when I was 22, a small, one-bedroom in an older building. The place had charm, but also a weird energy about it. The landlord was an old man, but he was kind enough to show me around when I signed the lease. One thing that stood out to me was the locked room at the end of the hall. It was at the far end of the apartment floor, a door that had no key, no sign of ever being opened. The landlord never mentioned it, but I could always feel something was off about that spot. At first, I dismissed it as just a quirky part of the building, but over the weeks, I began noticing strange things. At night, sometimes I'd hear faint tapping or scraping sounds coming from the direction of that locked door. It wasn't a constant noise, just sporadic, like someone was pacing behind it or perhaps scratching the walls. Curious but reluctant, I asked the landlord about it one day. He just smiled awkwardly and said, "Oh, that room's been locked for years. Don't worry about it. Just an old storage room." But I could tell he was hiding something. His voice faltered, like he was covering up a secret he didn't want to acknowledge. One evening, after a particularly long and tiring day at work, I came home and was about to collapse on the couch when I heard it. The unmistakable sound of scratching coming from behind the locked door. It was louder this time, almost frantic. I froze, listening. My heart was pounding. I knew I couldn't ignore it any longer. I grabbed a flashlight, my mind racing with possibilities. Maybe an animal had gotten inside somehow. I approached the door and pressed my ear against the wood. The scratching stopped abruptly, replaced by a strange muffled voice, barely audible, like someone was whispering through the walls. "Help me," it whispered. "Please, let me out." I stepped back, heart in my throat. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. There was no way anyone could be in there. That door had been locked for years, and the landlord said there was no key. My first instinct was to call someone, but I didn't know who to call. So I did the only thing I could think of. I grabbed a crowbar from my toolbox and started prying at the door. It took several minutes of desperate effort, but the door finally gave way with a loud crack. It creaked open slowly, revealing nothing. The room was completely empty. No furniture, no signs of life, just dust and cobwebs everywhere. But then I saw something strange. The floor was covered in faint, scuffed markings, like someone had been dragged across it. Just as I was about to turn around and leave, I noticed something else. Scratches on the wall. Fresh scratches, as though someone had tried to claw their way out. The whispering started again, only this time, it was louder. It wasn't a voice from the past. It was now as if someone was in that room with me. Before I could react, I felt a hand, cold, clammy, grip my shoulder. I spun around, but no one was there. The door slammed shut behind me, and when I turned the handle to open it, it was locked again, just like before. Panic set in. I started banging on the door, screaming for help. It took what felt like forever, but eventually I was able to get out. I was drenched in sweat, my heart racing, but the door was locked again, and everything was exactly as it had been before. I moved out a week later. To this day, I can't explain what happened that night, but I've never gone near a locked door like that again. I sometimes wonder, was it really empty, or was something trapped in there, waiting for someone to open it again?